On behalf of the Klau Center, welcome to today's panel on the verdict in the Derek Chauvin case and the future of police reform. I'm Silas Altheimer, a second-year law student and the Klau Center's graduate assistant. In that capacity, I have been running an advanced study for graduate students on race, justice, and policing. Last week's conviction of Derek Chauvin and the murder of George Floyd brought a feeling of relief across the country and a sense of hope that perhaps this could be an important moment for racial justice and accountability in policing. We have three panelists today to help us unpack this historic moment and think through the context, implications, and promise of the Chauvin verdict. Professor Richard Pearce is an associate professor of history and Africana studies and a Klau Center faculty fellow. Professor Jennifer Mason McAward is an associate professor of law and the director of the Klau Center. And Emmanuel Cannady is a PhD candidate in sociology and a graduate student affiliate of the Klau Center. Thank you and welcome to each of you. Before we begin, if you would like to ask any questions, please forward them to the lower right-hand corner under Q&A. We will try to get to them towards the end of the discussion today. Professor Pearce, we'll get started with you. Can you offer a few preliminary comments regarding the Chauvin verdict and where it falls in the historical context of police violence?
Thank you, Silas, for allowing me to share a panel with such an august group of colleagues in the Klau Center platform that has become must-see Zoom viewing during the pandemic. I am humbled to participate. My challenge to contextualize the historical contours of police violence is burdensome. One of the key elements of the challenge is that in America, policing is essentially a local affair. Each village, town, city, and county may sponsor a police force with its own rules of engagement. Only sporadically has the federal government sought to study race in policing. Consequently, we do not have good, consistent data for analysis. Repeated calls for accountability brought to the creation in 2015 of the FBI's National Use of Force Data Collection Initiative. Participation in the data collection is open to all federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement and investigative agencies. Participation is voluntary, however, thereby bringing into question its effectiveness and its accuracy. So I'm looking at the dilemma, Silas, a dilemma. Do I provide a cursory overview of noted encounters between Blacks and the police, so often derisively described as the riots by the media? Or should I report a sampling of extant statistics, including the caveat that data collection has been substandard? Perhaps I should play an intellectual version of Connect the Dots, where I begin with slave patrols and with modern day militarized police forces and indicate that each share dedication of curtailing African Americans' freedom of movement and exercise of rights. I choose this fourth option instead, and includes a challenge for the listeners today. Throughout the 20th century, most cities in America with a Black population of a certain size had a newspaper, usually a weekly. These unheralded organs were the most reliable chronicle of the African American community. Here's the challenge. Study the newspapers in aggregate, and please let us know the year when there was not the violent altercation between the police members of the Black community somewhere in the United States. Long before the creation of the internet, Blacks learned of atrocities through the Black press. And therein lies the dilemma. Modern day reform efforts work within the spectrum of what has gone before. They are battling history, and that is a heavy lift. It is implausible that African Americans or police officers will rarely transform their vision and see as an ally that they formerly saw as a threat. I want to be personal here, and I'll be remiss if I didn't offer this reflection. I have enduring encounters with police officers. I have been placed in handcuffs. I have confronted twin warring impulses to resist and to comply. Perhaps that is why I empathize with Charles McMillan. McMillan was a 61-year-old Black man who broke down while testifying in Minneapolis. McMillan tearfully recounted how he begged Mr. Floyd to comply while that man was merely trying to breathe. I cried with McMillan because I share with him the sense of frustration and futility of fighting against a system that demands more than compliance, it requires subjugation. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? Martin Luther King asked in his iconic I Have a Dream speech, 1963. His words continue to resonate today after a long history of violent confrontations between African-American citizens and the police. King answered his own rhetorical question. He said, quote, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is a victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality," end quote. And I, for one, am not satisfied.
Thank you, Professor Pearce. Professor McAward, I'm hoping you can provide some explanation of the legal posture of the Chauvin case and related cases. Just to start out, what happens next in the Chauvin case itself?
Thanks, Silas, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I'm just delighted and honored to be here with you today. So in Chauvin's case itself, we're trying to make sure that he's personally held accountable for what he did to George Floyd. And so the first phase, as we saw, was in the Hennepin County Criminal Court. So the trial's over, and now, as we've all heard, sentencing is next. It'll take about 2 months, and the judge will gather information about kind of other parts of Chauvin's life. Was he engaged in other misconduct, as it seems, as a police officer? And what were the aggravating circumstances of the murder itself? And so, as we know, the presumptive sentence is about 12 and a half years, but it could go higher if the judge finds aggravating circumstances. After he's sentenced, there will be appeals. So he is constitutionally entitled to appeal his conviction. And so there was some talk in the news toward the end of the trial. The judge had, over the course of the trial, rejected claims to either sequester the jury or to be concerned about external forces that might be acting on the jury. But there was a Representative Maxine Waters who said something along the lines of, well, if the conviction doesn't come, we might have to, as the public, we might have to get more confrontational. And the judge says, look, I'm not sure that the jury even knew about that. I'm not sure if they would have cared if they did know about it. But the judge said, Chauvin may raise that point on appeal. And so we may see those kinds of claims couched in due process coming up over the coming months and years in the appeal. But even once the criminal case is done, that's not the end of the road for Chauvin himself, because he may face federal civil rights lawsuits. The federal government has already impaneled a criminal grand jury to consider criminal charges against him, and George Floyd's family may file a federal civil rights action against him to recoup money damages. And the idea behind those is that as a government officer, Chauvin was bound to respect George Floyd's constitutional rights. And by using excessive force in violation of the Fourth Amendment, Chauvin might be held criminally or civilly liable, spending time in jail or paying money damages over and above whatever happens in state court.
Thank you, Professor McAward, for your explanation, analysis, and comments. Just a quick follow-up. The criminal verdict and any additional civil rights actions certainly are going to contribute to holding Mr. Chauvin himself accountable, but how might the legal field and the legal system also help us towards more systemic change and more widespread accountability?
So that's exactly right, and that's an important distinction. So the criminal process is meant to hold Chauvin himself accountable, and that's a very important thing in the case and as a symbolic matter. It is exceedingly rare for police officers to be charged, much less convicted, when they kill somebody, much less a Black person. But beyond individual accountability, the goal is to make this case not just a symbol, but a real inflection point, after which we see strides toward real and systemic justice. If we think about Chauvin as just one bad apple, then the criminal case would be enough. But if the problem is really an embedded culture of violence and racism in the police department, then we need to think beyond just the criminal case. And so I just want to point to two developments that may push us toward that broader systemic justice goal. The first is that there's another criminal case pending against the 3 officers who were on the scene when Chauvin murdered Floyd. And they've been charged with aiding and abetting the murder, and they're going to go to trial, and they can also face substantial jail time. The fact that there was a whole team of officers who saw and did nothing may well point to a culture of impunity and tolerance of abusive behavior in the police department. And so if they're convicted, that could send a message to other police officers that they can't stand by anymore when one of their own engages in excessive force. And so there could be a real deterrent effect that comes from that other case. Even more important than that is the investigation that was launched by the Justice Department this past Wednesday, the day after the verdict. And so I just wanted to tell you a little bit about that. It's called a pattern and practice investigation, and they've been very effective in the past at creating that kind of systemic change. So this is a civil investigation that's been launched by the Justice Department, and the goal is system-wide change. It's not individual accountability. And so the Justice Department is going to conduct interviews with police officers and with community members. They're going to do everything from reviewing arrest reports to citizen complaints to official training policies. And the question is there some kind of system-wide problem here in Minneapolis of using excessive force or of kind of systemic racism in their policing? And so if the Justice Department concludes that there is a system-wide problem, then usually what happens is it gets together with the police department and comes up with a settlement. It's called a consent decree because a court can enforce it and impose sanctions on the police department if they don't comply with it. And so as part of that consent decree, a police department can agree to do everything from engage in better data collection. As Professor Pearce said, there's really just not enough data out there to be able to know what's going on. They could have stricter use of force rules, better training regimens, stricter accountability mechanisms within the department. And we know that when these consent decrees are ordered, it's led to real and sustainable change in police departments. And here in Minneapolis, the mayor, the city council, and the police chief have all welcomed the engagement of the Justice Department. And so this is a really, really important moment for getting toward that goal of systemic justice, in addition to the individual accountability of Derek Chauvin.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your analysis and your explanation of patterns in practice and just more new concepts for us to really just keep in mind. Let's shift to Mr. Cannady. Mr. Cannady, as a sociologist and someone who is actively working in racial justice in your local community, can you talk us through the role of this summer's protests and social movement and bringing us to this point of accountability? Where do we go from here? Where do you see the moment or the movement going from here, especially with respect to police reform? And we can leave it at that for starters.
Yeah, that sounds great. And thank you for having me on this panel. And yeah, let's just jump right into it. So my name is Emmanuel Kennedy. I have been an activist within the Black Lives Matter movement for the last 4.5 years, all of them in South Bend, Indiana. And so I've really seen a wave of when the movement has risen, when it has dropped off, and especially last summer when the movement kind of took over this global significance where now everybody is saying Black Lives Matter and what to do with that space. In terms of the trial of George Floyd, his murder, the Derek Chauvin trial, not a lot has changed within the movement in and of itself because Black people are still getting killed, you know. I think I saw 4 examples over the past week while people were celebrating the conviction of Derek Chauvin, where we're still having the same sort of conversation, still going through the same sort of rigmarole where there's a shooting and then there's a place of there's protests, and then there's this kind of back and forth between sort of conservative sources telling the people that, oh, this is just a bad apple, and then other folks on the other side saying, well, this is a systemic thing that needs to be changed. And we're still having sort of that dialectic back and forth. And something needs to change. I hope Dr. McAward is right, that this is an inflection point where it tells other officers that they are no longer, they shouldn't be complicit in silence when something does happen, that they too will be held responsible. Dante Wright was just murdered a couple miles down the road from where the trial just happened, when an officer she mistaken her taser for an actual gun. Adam Toledo was a 7th grader in Chicago, Illinois, who was gunned down. Isaiah Brown in Virginia just the other day ago, the officer that brought him home was called back to the scene a couple hours later and then shot him. And then Micaiah Bryant in Columbus, Ohio, which there was conflicting reports of if if she was lunging at the police officer with a knife or not, and then the officer just unloaded his firearm into her. And so what we see for in the wake of George Floyd was that there was a lot of joy, but there was almost an instantaneous pivot to, this is just a start. Individual accountability doesn't address the structural issues that are happening in our communities. And so there is this strong push, and I think you'll see from the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, which Black Lives Matter South Bend, which I am a part of, is an official chapter of that network. There's just a strong push for abolition of policing in its form. And it's not to say that there's nothing going to be there, but it's to reconceptualize what community safety looks like. Imagine it this way. I'll ask you to step in the shoes of somebody who lives in a community of hyper-surveillance and hyper-policing, and then when you call the police, somebody gets shot. Just think of, like, go back to your neighborhood. Maybe you're sitting at home right now working. Maybe you'll go home at the end of a work day, to your community, to your neighborhood, to your family. Maybe you know your next door neighbor. Maybe you live in a cul-de-sac or down a road. Maybe you're in a particular community. But I just want you to vision what your community looks like and kind of hold it there. And then I want you to envision that a public servant comes into your community every once in a while, just to check to see if things are okay. Maybe they're an electrician that kind of comes by. Maybe it is a police officer that just kind of comes by and sees your neighborhood, and just kind of checks it out. Now I wanted you to imagine that there's a conflict that happens in your community, that there's two members of your community that are in a scuffle, or maybe there isn't a conflict. Maybe there's just something that doesn't seem right. And you call that person, that community servant, to come over to your community. Now imagine that person shoots your community member. How would you feel about that, really? Would you trust that person that is coming over to your community? Would you trust where that person works for to be invited back into your community? And I hope the answer is no. I hope the answer is, you know what? We don't trust this person because they took a member of our community away from us. We don't trust the company that they work for. If it was the plumber that came in, I guarantee you most people wouldn't call that plumbing company back again to do more work in their community. And that's how, so sit with that. Because that's how a lot of Black communities are in our country, is that there's community servants that are coming over that they're supposed to be there to serve and to protect and be there for the wellness and the safety of our community members, but somebody ends off dead. Imagine the frustration that Black communities have when people are saying, yeah, they should be allowed to come back in your community. They should have their badge, and the organization that they represent should be the ones that are surveilling their community. It becomes madness at that point. And that's where a lot of the sentiment of abolition of the police comes from, is that this isn't working. As Dr. Pearce was saying too, this has been historical in how we understand policing structures that have policed Black bodies for hundreds of years, from the original slave catchers and fugitive slave laws that were legal at the time, to now that we are controlling Black bodies. And when somebody gets killed, that's just the ultimate end. But there's a lot of instances where people are arrested and entered into the system, and that puts a whole system of barriers in front of somebody who maybe just was in a scuffle out in front of their yard. So when we think about community policing, a lot of people are like, you know what, just get rid of it. It isn't working. It's rooted in slavery and the history of racism. It's been passed down for hundreds of years, and now we see it in terms of how we understand our mass incarceration system. So what activists are really pushing for, and what we've been pushing for as activists within the Black Lives Matter movement, is a more comprehensive care model and how we understand care and safety in our communities. And this means defunding the police, but also putting most of that money into other resources that have been extracted from communities. So interventionists, a lot of professions intervene in crisis situations, and they don't rely on guns to shoot people to do that. A lot of trained counselors out there do that. People that work in hospitals do this all the time. School teachers do this all the time. If you work with other aggrieved populations, you do this all the time without shooting somebody. So there's a perfect capability and a structure that allows for that sort of way of entering into communities that doesn't end up somebody dead or arrested and injected into a carceral system that is almost impossible to escape. Community programs are going to be huge. Investing in housing, and when people are stressed out, they do things that they may not want to do. I mean, we all know that. Even when we're hungry, we get kind of agitated. Now imagine structures are put into place that that tell folks that they can't get anything more than this. People get stressed out. So housing, investing in schooling, mental health services, people are traumatized. Racism is a traumatic experience for Black and brown bodies all across the world, and especially in this country. And systemic racism is something that it doesn't need to be solved through punitive measures, but through healing. And some of the other structural issues too, like lead abatement. So a lot of Black communities still are suffering from either bad pipes and other environmental justices, maybe lead paint as well. Investing in job programs, investing in Black-owned businesses and business ventures, and something that a lot of the movement is working on now, either the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation or the Movement for Black Lives, is investing in electoral justice. I think this past election has shown kind of the electoral power of Black folks, and it has scared a lot of folks on the conservative side. And so what you see is that hundreds of these bills that are put forth by conservative legislators are trying to repress voting that more Democratic voters definitely, but also Black voters have really resolved to because of the pandemic. And so there's a lot of ways forward, and I think policing is just kind of the tip of the iceberg of all of the other structural issues that the movement is going to continue to keep pressing forward. But I do think that this is a moment where people in the movement are a lot more realistic. If George Zimmerman got I would venture to guess that if George Zimmerman in 2013 got a guilty verdict, first of all, there wouldn't have been a Black Lives Matter movement in the way that it is conceptualized now too. And secondly, I don't think that excuse me, what was I gonna say? I forgot that point, I'm sorry. But that's it. I don't think that people would understand the role that activism has to play in keeping these pressures on. I think people would be complacent and they would take a look at individuals and say, we got a big win, and then we would just kind of move on. But what the movement is saying is that we received accountability for one person, but we haven't seen justice in general. And I think that's what the movement is going to keep moving forward. That's what we're doing as an organization here locally. And I think that's what a lot of the other larger organizations and hundreds of community organizers or community organizations around the country are going to continue to do too.
Thank you, Mr. Cannady, for just showing not only just showing your analysis and your experience, but also showing your emotion as well. Thank you very much for that. I would like to, before I go to the panel for follow-up questions, I just want to just share what the Race and Policing Reading Group has been for the entire year at the Klau Center. During the first semester, we took a look at the history of policing in the early 1900s and late 1800s post-Reconstruction. And we looked at sort of the creation of the modern day police force in conjunction with just how the South was using the police to really subjugate and manage Black people, as well as the rate of frivolous jailing and just mass jailing of Black people in the American South. And so our central text for that was Douglas Blackman's Slavery by Another Name. For this semester, we kind of took a different look by asking ourselves, what does Black liberation, what does anti-police brutality activism look like post Breonna Taylor and post George Floyd? And so two of our central texts were From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor and Invisible No More by Andrea Ritchie. And so we used those two texts to really uncover intersectionality and how does that sort of complicate even more sort of topics in regards to police brutality. So what we're going to do next is I will ask just a follow-up question to each of our three panelists individually, and we'll start with Professor Pearce. Professor Pearce, you talked about how subjugation is often what communities expect from Black people, not just compliance when it comes to dealing with the police. And you also said that this has become more a community problem, whereas only the federal government has really taken steps towards looking at this. Can you follow up more on what you were talking about when it comes to subjugation, and what has been sort of the major problems of anti-police brutality activism within communities?
Certainly, but before I answer that, I have to add another book to your reading list, if I may. David Oshinsky's Worse Than Slavery, which chronicles the convict leased labor system, which conscripted Black Americans, mostly Blacks, to work for no wages for violations of minor crimes, sometimes trumped up charges. I think that'll add to your discussion. But in answer to your question, communities bear a lot of responsibility, but also, in my mind, an opportunity. Because right now, taxpayers pay the settlements most times for these large payouts in the case of police brutality. I think that should be shifted to police officers themselves, to their unions, to the police departments to pay the premiums for these insurance policies, thereby shifting the responsibility from the community taxpayers to the police forces themselves. I think that'd bring about some immediate change. That's one of the things that Rayshard Ray, the sociologist at the University of Maryland, has proposed as a way to get more accountability from police officers.
Thank you very much, Professor Pearce. Thank you very much. Professor McAward, I have a follow-up question for you as well. One of the key phrases when we're talking about police brutality is excessive force. Can you explain to us, or can you explain how we understand when police violence is unconstitutionally excessive? And will the Chauvin case at all change how we view that standard?
Sure, thanks. So the question with excessive force is it's an exercise in line drawing, because we know that police officers are going to use force. That's an inherent and inevitable part of their job. And the question is, what's allowed in any given situation and when do they go too far? And so as it stands today, uniformly, courts, police departments engaged in their own kind of internal accountability mechanisms, the rule is one of deference. And the idea is that police officers enter dangerous, volatile situations in which they have to make split-second decisions. And sometimes in that kind of situation, a police officer might deliberately cross the line, kneeling on a person's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Sometimes though, police officers are going to make mistakes. In the worst case, they might shoot a person who is in fact not dangerous or who could be subdued without the use of lethal force. And so when an officer makes a mistake, even recklessly, and gets charged criminally or gets sued for money damages, the standard is, did the officer act reasonably in light of the circumstances? And the Supreme Court, in fleshing out that standard, has said, look, we can't second guess what officers do with the benefit of hindsight. And so therefore, we want to, according to the Supreme Court, give really wide deference unless there's clearly unreasonable conduct. So in the Chauvin case, there was clearly unreasonable conduct. So there was some back and forth in the criminal trial, but it was clear on which side of the line his conduct fell. But the problem is that in even slightly closer cases, what we need to think about is how to make that standard more nuanced. How do police departments and state and local governments maybe come up with their own excessive force standards to guide police conduct? And so questions that they need to ask and that courts need to ask include things like, how imminent was the threat posed by the person who was the subject of excessive force? Did the officer try to de-escalate the situation before engaging in force, if that was possible? Did the officer, on the other hand, do things that escalated the situation and led to the use of force? Were there any other reasonable alternatives that the officer could have or should have tried? And so it's that more nuanced understanding that you are now seeing a movement toward, in light of not just George Floyd, but all of these killings of unarmed people. And so it could be that kind of change comes through things like the pattern and practice investigations that I talked about. They could be voluntarily adopted by police departments. They could be set out in court decisions. But I do think that there is a sense at this moment that there needs to be a more fact-intensive inquiry when it comes to excessive force, and that kind of blind deference to police officers has not gotten us to where we need to be.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your comments. Mr. Cannady, we are back at you, and I have two follow-up questions for you, Mr. Cannady. Number one, just assuming that we agree about reimagining community safety, to what extent should we continue to use abolition compared to whether it be defund or reform or community safety? Does abolition itself put a liability on the amount of support for police reform? To what extent, because I'm a law student, you're a PhD student, to what extent should we still consider sort of the tactical implications of using the term abolition?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it actually gets at kind of the heart of my own research agenda. I look at knowledge deployment within social movements. So how do social movement actors deploy certain places of knowledge? Does it come from sort of their academic experiences? Does it come from their academic knowledge and kind of understanding of theories? But does it come from their experiences with racism? And within that, I think there's a reimagining of how we tend to understand our lexicon and verbiage that we do use. And the term abolition and how it's used, if it's put in its context, it comes from a long history of Black death, the hundreds of thousands and even millions of Black bodies that have perished in policing paradigms, either through actual killings or policing structures. That makes it a very hard sell to, I think, a lot of people to say that reformation is the way to go. And so when we hear the word abolition, I think we also need to pay attention to what does that word mean in its fullest of its context. And for a lot of people, that word is very important because it means Black death. But if you strip it from its context, it means that, oh, people just want to do away with the police because they don't want police and everything's going to run rampant. It makes it very difficult for a lot of communities because a lot of places, like, objectively aren't safe. So there needs to be some sort of structure that can help out when there's legitimate danger that is happening in communities. And so it places a lot of Black folks in a very difficult situation. A lot of Black folks love police I'm thinking of South Bend now, where there is kind of a conflict where folks want police and they feel safer when there is a police armadillo stationed in it's a big tactical truck that SWAT teams use, is stationed in there where they feel safer in the communities because there's legitimate danger that is happening. But at the same time, there's also the fear of, do I call the police officers because is the situation only going to escalate from there? And so you have people that are living in chaos, not knowing what to do. And so what abolition does, it says to scrap it and then reimagine something newer, better, fresher, that's updated, to truly understand how can we truly care about communities. Tactfully, I'm probably going to still use the word abolition because I want to center the experiences of Black folks that have been devastated by these structures. But for other folks, I can see where the trepidation might come into play when talking about getting rid of a structure that is essential or foundational to kind of how we understand community safety.
Thank you very much for that. Before I ask another question to you, Mr. Cannady, I believe that Professor Pearce has a follow-up to his statement.
Not to my statement, but to Professor McAward's statement. You know, it kind of struck me because in the 1830s, when we created the Boston Police Force, which was the first modern police force in the North, called shortly thereafter by New York, they had a very long, protracted discussion about how much force can a police officer use? Could they even carry a weapon? So these questions are not new. These questions are eternal to police forces because we recognize the dangerous job they have, but also the immense power that they carry. So the history of policing is very complex and kind of convoluted at many times. And the courts have tried to parse, from my perspective, Professor McAward, they tried to parse, you know, this human interest of the police lives that matter, as well as communities' lives that matter as well.
Thank you, Professor Pearce. And before we get to your questions, we're going to ask Mr. Cannady one last question. I've gotten a few from the Q&A, and they have been really, really good. Just Mr. Cannady, real quick, what are you involved in Black Lives Matter specifically in South Bend? And can you tell us what the movement is looking like at the ground in this community? But then also, there are a lot of attendees who are our classmates. And so if you could just offer just a few words in terms of how they can get involved in terms of whether it be activism or really just staying awake in terms of what is going on.
Those are wonderful questions, and thank you for everybody for showing up today to want to know more and to get involved. So Black Lives Matter South Bend, a lot of what we do is we address political structures. We're about trying to address policy changes. And so when Dr. McAward was talking about use of force policy and community relations with police, those are conversations that Black Lives Matter South Bend has been involved in. There was just last Wednesday a Board of Public Safety meeting. It was virtual that some of our members participated in, and the mayor unveiled the changes to the use of force policy. Now, Black Lives Matter South Bend for the last about a year and a half has been incredibly involved in that the language around that use of force policy. So we've sat into a series of community meetings. We've had meetings with the mayor to talk about that language. We have organized ourselves to really pick apart what that use of force policy is ourselves, and then have presented our what our suggestions are to the mayor and to a couple members of the Common Council. And so a lot of the work is very much in kind of the political realm. We just a couple months ago got a civilian review board with subpoena power bill passed through the local Common Council, which has been something that the community has been working on for the last 6 years. And that was a major win for us as an organization. And now it's about the implementation of that. And so a lot of our members too are trying to figure out what goes into hiring the person that's going to direct that office, who is going to sit on this community board. So the wins are great, but it's always, okay, what do we have to do next? In terms of getting involved, there is a difference, just to clarify for folks, there's a difference between the movement itself and then the movement organization and the small body of people that are coming together to kind of organize resources and send out messaging. And there's a couple things you can do. Go to our Facebook page, Black Lives Matter South Bend, and subscribe to that. When we have events, they're definitely there. When we make asks for people to attend certain meetings and events, those are there. So go ahead and do that. We also have an Instagram and a Twitter account too. But if you really want to get involved in kind of the local happenings, just come to the community meetings. South Bend is a small enough town, about 100,000 people, that just keep showing up and showing that you're interested in this sort of work, and eventually you just kind of get involved in that work. People are in the community are looking for talented individuals that care about these issues. So to the students out there that are also interested in that, I welcome you to come to Common Council meetings. Black Lives Matter also has open meetings, I think, every other week, and you can find that information on our Facebook page too.
Great, thank you very much. And then we just have a question, really just for the panel at large. This was a good one. To what extent do we believe that, or to what extent did public reaction to George Floyd's murder influence the verdict? And what does the public influence tell us about the Black Lives Matter movement? And we can begin with Professor Pearce, then Professor McAward, and then Mr. Cannady.
Can you repeat the question, Silas?
Absolutely, absolutely. Did the public reaction to George Floyd's murder influence the verdict? And what does public influence tell us about the Black Lives Matter movement?
I think that the video influenced the jury more than the demonstrations. The demonstrations before, they didn't have net and conviction, but they didn't have the video 9 minutes and 26 seconds of kneeling on someone's neck. That to me was the most powerful testimony. And that the second question about the Black Lives Matter, is that the question?
Yes, Professor, yes. It was regarding, and what does public influence tell us about the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of the power and influence that Black Lives Matter has right now?
No, I support Mr. Kennedy's efforts along with his colleagues at Black Lives Matter. I wish I was more active myself. They have a very diverse agenda, from lead abatement to police involvement and police monitoring, I should say. But I think that they're a watchdog, and I think that we need watchdogs because nothing changes without pressure. And their organization has been maligned, I think, unmercifully and also erroneously, calling them all kinds of things from socialists to disruptors to anti-fascists. And I wish them well, and I wish to join them.
Professor McAward?
Sure, I can jump in here. I think it's human nature to be self-protective and to be protective of your colleagues. And we saw that play out in the George Floyd case. So I don't know if our viewers remember, but right after George Floyd's death, the Minneapolis Police Department released a statement. And the title was, "Man Dies After Medical Incident During Police Interaction." And the news release described a suspected money forger who, quote, physically resisted police, during which time the officers noted that he appeared to be suffering medical distress. So that was at the beginning of the case. And then during the trial itself, the chief of police testified against Derek Chauvin. And last week, the chief of police welcomed the Justice Department pattern and practice investigation. So what changed from that kind of statement of denial to the statement of embracing accountability and change? I think the answer is there is a video that showed 9 minutes and 29 seconds of horror, and there was a summer of protests. And so that kind of level of public horror and public engagement in this case shows that each one of us as citizens has a responsibility to make sure that there's adequate oversight of police. And so to Emmanuel's point about kind of the mechanisms in South Bend or other cities, I think as citizens, we have a responsibility to make sure that the right people are at the table and are engaging these questions. And another way is to document and report abuses when we see them at the hands of the police. But I just think that the disparity between the beginning and the end of the Floyd case in terms of the police department's reaction tells us a lot about the impact of the public engagement with the case.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you, Jen. And I think while the transfer in the Minneapolis case was stark, Breonna Taylor's case had a lot of people in the streets as well, a lot of protesting, and it didn't have the same result. So I'm a little bit leery of giving too much credit to the public domain because there was no video with Breonna Taylor, and video seems to be the catalyst for conviction.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to concur with that too, is that the video evidence makes it a lot easier. Breonna Taylor, we don't have a video of that. And so I think for activists or anybody who's a bystander, even just whipping out your camera and videotaping kind of what's going on can be in itself a place of activism too. So I mean, we all carry surveillance equipment in our pockets everywhere we go now with our cell phones. So I don't think that's going to change. But what I would like to see moving forward, though, is that police killings actually stop. I mean, like I said before, even with the conviction of Derek Chauvin, people are still, the bodies are still piling up. So, I mean, I think the movement is going to continue forward. I think that the framing of the movement as in the phrase Black Lives Matter allows a lot of people to come forward. And I think something that hasn't been mentioned yet too is kind of the strength of Black women in the movement who have really pushed the movement forward and have already had a lot of structures in place through these organizations, these community organizations that are doing on the ground work already and have been doing it for decades. But now Black Lives Matter provides a nice framing for that. So the organization is there, and now there's a concise frame to do that. But I think the movement is even more than just about Black lives. It truly is about all lives. When we have a police accountability structure in South Bend, Indiana, that is by the public, everybody gets a benefit from that. If we have a system of community safety that have a model that looks like a positive model within Black communities, well, guess what? Everybody gets to see that model, and then they can copy that model and place that in other communities. So this idea that that things that are only benefiting Black folks are that are only benefiting them or us is just completely wrong, because our society becomes better once we start solving these issues that are affecting Black people.
Can I just jump in with one more point, just to follow up, especially on Professor Pearce's point? I think this question of the video is really important, and I think it's important to drill down on it, right? So we know that police departments are starting to require their officers to wear body cams, and I think there's an upside and a downside to that. You know, when there is video, it can be really compelling, but how easy is it for officers to make a mistake and turn it off? And then what happens when there's not video, right? What happens in the Breonna Taylor case? And so in some of my classes, I talk about the CSI effect, right? Where we come to expect that there's forensic evidence in every criminal case. And if there's not, we're not as confident about the case itself. And so I wonder if there might be a body cam effect where we come to expect there to be video evidence in every case. And then what happens when there's not? Do we somehow discredit what other witnesses are telling us. And so I think there's a real upside and downside to body cams and to looking toward video evidence itself. I think it's really important to credit people who are witnesses as well as looking to video evidence because we want to treat like cases equally, even when there's not a video there to back up the story that we're hearing.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think there is a CSI effect. I welcome research on that issue because it seems to me that if you don't have a video camera, you're not gonna get a conviction, or maybe even not even get a charge. So I welcome that research.
Thank you so much for your comments. And even listening to this conversation right now, there still is the fight to really exist along the same lines as others when it comes to the police. It seems as if the whole point of the Black Lives Matter movement is to stop the attempts of or excessive force and to stop attempts to render Black people non-existent, to deny the existence of Black people. And that's not, that's really seems to be one of the obstacles today. And that's why I really applaud Mr. Kennedy for really your activism, because that's a daily fight, a weekly fight, a yearly fight to really fight for the right to exist before the eyes of a police officer. I do want to just ask one last question that's coming from me. To what extent do you regard education, whether it be in your respective professions or just education in general, as important to understanding or to, I guess you could say, to making sure that people understand that police brutality is a problem, but that police brutality can be stopped? To what extent has education really influenced your own work or your own activism?
Are you talking about my personal education, or are you talking about just kind of inner education in general?
I would say education in general. How important is to educate people about these issues, I would say. And this is to all three panelists.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to know certain things. I think that so a quick example, last summer during the George Floyd protests, there was a lot of education on kind of what the social contract was that came out of those protests, but also kind of the history and legacy of policing in this country that I don't think existed in the public discourse in a way than it did last summer. And that, so it gave a sort of framing behind how policing has affected communities of color historically and traditionally in our country. So I think any opportunity that folks have to educate themselves is important. I would turn folks to some of the books that you, Silas, and Dr. Pearce had talked about earlier. The education needs to be the right type of education too. It can't just be looking at a random YouTube video of somebody, but it has to be education either coming from a reputable source, or I would just go out and talk to somebody, you know, about their experience. Patricia Hill Collins talks about Black feminist epistemologies, in which she really dives into the experience that doesn't follow this sort of positivistic sort of tradition, but experiences are very real and very visceral to a lot of people that also count as knowledge and count as legitimate knowledge. And I would say, believe people when they tell you that something is wrong in their communities too. So we can learn more than just from a book in a textbook and reading, or reading Michelle Alexander's A New Jim Crow, which should help out, but don't be afraid to talk to somebody about their situations, and believe people when they share their stories too.
I can jump in here. All year, the Klau Center has been doing a weekly lecture series called Building an Anti-Racist Vocabulary. And so each week, we welcome an expert on some aspect of racial justice and racial injustice to educate our students in our community on these issues. And the constant refrain that we've heard from our listeners and our students every week this year is that I never knew the existence of this problem, or I never knew the full extent of this problem on X topic, whether it's housing discrimination or voting rights or police brutality. And so I think that any opportunity for education is truly critical. It not only expands the minds of people, but I think it really changes people's hearts when you realize that what we're dealing with is just an affront to human dignity, the dignity of our Black brothers and sisters. But I also think that education has to make sure that it doesn't stop at the point of despair or disillusionment, but really has to provide strategies for change and for hope. And so that's why I think that especially Emmanuel's contributions are so important, because they're giving us those tools to think about how each one of us as a citizen and as a human being can be more engaged in the struggle for racial justice that is so important.
I concur with my panelists, and I want to applaud the anti-racist vocabulary series, which I think is wonderful. What I think is most wonderful about it is that, I said this from the very beginning, if all this is about police reform, we miss a tremendous opportunity, because we need more than just police reform, we need more systemic reform. I think the anti-racist vocabulary series has provided us with the language and the opportunity to bring that reform about into meaningful practice.
Thank you, Professor Pearce. Thank you, Professor McAward. Thank you, Mr. Cannady. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you, attendees, for taking the time out of your day to attend this panel regarding the Chauvin verdict, as well as what can we do moving forward, really in the next couple of years in terms of re-educating ourselves, but also educating others